Welcome back to Giant Monster Games. I'm Adrian, and today we are doing a $68 budget Izzet Delver deck. For those that don't know, Izzet is a blue-red deck. There are some specific archetypes around Izzet as a whole, but in this case we're actually going to be going for a little bit of a different build than you might expect. Before we jump in, don't forget to vote for the next budget deck. There's a little thing up in the top right-hand corner up there where you can vote, and it'll help me drive what you guys want to see. Let's jump in, starting with creatures, specifically Delver of Secrets. We are running 4 copies of this guy. This card is actually what the deck is named after because it is such a value creature that it's hard not to play it when you're playing a deck like the one we're playing today. So what does this creature actually do? It is a 1-cost 1/1 creature, which is not that special. But at the beginning of your upkeep, you may look at and then reveal the top card of your library. If it is an instant or sorcery, you may transform Delver of Secrets. He transforms into a 3/2 flying creature, which, you can use to pound your opponent in the face for pretty quickly. Now, we have 26 instant or sorceries in this deck, so we have almost a 50% chance of flipping him the turn after we play it, and if we use some scry, which we have a variety of cards that allow us to scry, we can actually set this up so it happens usually the turn after we play him. Carrying on to our next creature, we are running 4 copies of Young Pyromancer. Now, this little arsonist is allowing us to go wide if we need to go wide, or it allows us to create a whole bunch of chump blockers, because its ability is whenever we play an instant or sorcery, which we have a ton of in the deck, we get to put a 1/1 elemental creature token onto the battlefield. The general rule is if our opponent doesn't deal with this right away, we're going to go wide and it's going to be really hard for them to deal with us. And then on top of that, it's also a 2/1, so we can also swing in with it and do some extra damage. And our final creature is Niv-Magus Elemental. We're running 4 copies of this guy, and this is allowing us to do some very interesting things in this deck. So this card's ability is we can exile an instant or sorcery spell that we control off of the stack and put 2 1/1 counters on this guy. Which means we can cast some spells and treat them as a permanent buff for this guy at any time, so all of our instant spells do that. Or we can actually use this to get a little bit of value if we're playing against a deck that's going to counter one of our spells. So as soon as we do this once, he can't be bolted anymore, which makes him really resilient, especially once we get to the mid to late game. Something that I thought would be very important is Niv-Magus does not disrupt Young Pyromancer. Young Pyromancer gets triggered when we cast the spell, and then Niv-Magus can exile that card while it's actually on the stack. That's all of our creatures, so let's talk about spells now. The first spell we have is Serum Visions. You've seen this card a ton. I put it in a lot of my decks because it's so good. We're running 4 copies of this, and it's allowing us to draw a card, fix the top of our deck, and it also allows us to set up the top of our deck so we can actually get Delver of Secrets flipped as fast as possible. So it's doing a little bit more than most of the other decks we played in. Our second spell is Faithless Looting. We've also seen this card a whole bunch in different decks. We're running 2 copies of this, and this is giving us a couple different options. First, it's giving us card filtering so we can play it early game, mid game, late game to draw 2 cards and then discard the 2 cards we don't want. We can also cast it out of our graveyard, so it has a little bit of added bonus there. But its other interesting upside is we can use this to feed Niv-Magus. So if we're sitting in the late game and we don't necessarily need more cards or need specific cards, or if it's in our graveyard, we can easily just cast it, sack it off to Niv-Magus, and make it bigger. Moving into our damage package, we have 4 copies of Lightning Bolt. This is a pretty self-explanatory card. 1 red mana to do 3 damage to target creature or player is just absolutely fantastic, and it's kind of run in every single red deck unless there's a reason not to run it. Moving into our next damage spell, we have Magma Jet. We're running 2 copies of this card, and it's not necessarily the best damage spell, but it has an upside that we're interested in. It costs 2 mana, and it does 2 damage to target creature or player, but it also allows us to scry 2. Again, the importance of this is we can then set up our next turn, and we can help flip Delver of Secrets. So it's got some upsides. It's not the best spell, which is why we're only running 2 of it. And the last damage spell we have is Electrolyze. We're running 2 copies of this as well. It's not the absolute best spell, but it does have some really good upsides. It allows us to deal 2 damage divided as we choose amongst a number of 1 or 2 creatures. So as you can guess, we can take out a couple different mana dorks, or a couple different dumb creatures like Snapcaster Mage being my primary hatred creature at the moment, and we can also deal 1 damage to our opponent if it comes down to that as well. Oh, and it also draws us a card, so there's that as well. And the rest of our spells are part of our control package because that is also an important part of this deck. First of all, we have Izzet Charm. We're running 2 copies of this, and this is like the Swiss Army knife of this deck. This card does a little bit of everything. It can counter some instant sorcery spells for us, it can deal direct damage to creatures for us, and it can also allow us to filter some cards if that's also what we need. So it has a fix-all approach, so we're running it because it's way too handy not to. The second control-centric spell we have is Vapor Snag. We're running 3 copies of this guy, and it's allowing us to control the board state, hopefully killing our opponent's tempo, or clearing up the battlefield so we can make sure we get some damage in. It also does a little bit of damage to our opponent, which is nice. Unlike our next spell, which is Condescend. We're running 3 copies of this thing, and you can probably guess right away why we're running the spell. So 1, it is kind of like a mana leak, so we can use it to counter spell, but 2, it also has scry, so it's a counter spell that has a scry ability attached to it, which is really why it's in this deck. And it's actually not that bad when we get to late game, where we can just pay all of our mana to make sure our opponent can't cast whatever spell they're trying to cast anyways. And now we have a really weird one. We're running 4 copies of Giga Drowse. So what it does is it costs 1 blue mana to tap target permanent, which is fine in itself. But it also has Replicate for 1 blue mana as well, which means we can pay as much blue mana as we have available and tap that many permanents. This can work one of 2 ways. Either we can play it at the beginning of our opponent's upkeep, tap all their lands down or tap all their creatures down, or tap a combination of stuff. This is really good against Tron for the most part. Or pay all of our blue mana, which we can do at instant speed because it's an instant and we can just copy the spell like 3 or 4 times, and then sacrifice all of these spells to Niv Magnus because it creates a copy of the spell, and making him, +6/+6 in one go for 3 mana. Seriously, it is probably the most ridiculous card I've seen, and it works way too well in this deck. It's amazing. Anyways, our last card is 2 copies of Spreading Seas. Now this is an enchantment, so it doesn't trigger all of our creatures, but it does allow us to control our opponent, especially if we're playing against a 2 or 3 color deck, which is super popular right now, and it allows us to draw a card whenever we play it. So it's generally a really good card, and if we don't need it because we're playing against a monocolored deck, or we're playing against a deck that's playing blue, we can always just swap it out for all of the really good stuff we have in our sideboard. Now that would be a perfect segue to talk about our sideboard, but we're going to talk about our lands first. Starting off with Ghost Quarter. We're running 1 of this card, and it allows us to sacrifice Ghost Quarter and destroy a land. This is really good against 3 color decks, it's really good against Tron, and it's really good at killing manlands, which is super important for us. Then we have Shivan Reef. We're running 4 copies of this card, and it's just providing us some relatively budget mana fixing, which is something we really do need in this deck. Honestly, if we could run more lands that are doing both colors, that are not coming into play tapped, that would be ideal for this deck because there's a lot of times where we really want red, and we also really want blue. Speaking of red and blue, we have 7 mountains and 8 islands, which rounds out our entire mana base. Let's quickly jump over to talk about our sideboard because it is a huge part of this deck. The first card we have is 2 copies of Ceremonious Rejection, 2 copies of Dispel, and a single Negate. This is your alternative counter magic because this deck is really built to evolve depending on who you're playing against. Next we have a single copy of Twisted Image. This is designed to deal with cards that are really hard for us to deal with, such as Spellskite or Wall of Omens, where they have a really high toughness, something where we can't just bolt it away, and 0 power. Now we have 2 copies of Gutshot. This is really to deal with decks like Infect, where they may go off on turn 3, they may go off on turn 4. With Gutshot, we can still focus on developing our board state and still have a damage spell in our hand. 2 copies of Pyroplasm. This is a board sweeper if we need it. 2 copies of Tormod's Crypt if we need to get rid of someone's graveyard, such as Dredge. A single copy of Vandal Blast. This will get rid of a single artifact or all of the artifacts. And lastly, we have 2 copies of Crumble to Dust. This is specifically for things like Tron or other decks that rely on special lands. That is the entire budget Izzet Delver deck, but before we end the video, let's talk about some upgrades. First off, we have Shatter Spree. This is actually a sideboard card, but it plays really well with Niv Magnus Elemental, because it also has Replicate, so we can just replicate it 4 or 5 times, targeting only 1 artifact, and then sacrifice all of those spells or exile them to Niv Magnus Elemental and make him huge. Next we have Gitaxian Probe. This allows us to look at our opponent's hand and draw a card, and we can usually cast this by paying some life rather than actually having to pay mana for it, which is fantastic. Our counter magic can easily be upgraded. We can use cards like Cryptic Command, Spell Snare, and Remand to make our counter magic package way better. As far as creatures are concerned, Snapcaster Mage is like an auto-include if you have the money for him, because he allows us to cast any 1 spell out of our graveyard when we cast him. If you're looking for other interesting creature upgrades as well, Thing in the Ice and Bedlam Reaver tend to be really good upgrades for this deck, because Thing in the Ice allows us to get a huge creature when we eventually flip him, and we're just playing so many instant and sorcery spells, he's really easy to flip. And Bedlam Reaver, when we just blow away our hand, we actually get to draw a new hand from it. 3 cards, not a full hand. We get to draw a bunch of new cards for it. So they're both really cool, interesting upgrades. The deck can kind of go in 2 directions, one either counter magic direction, or one into like red deck win style direction. So the deck has room to grow in definitely ways that you want to be able to play it. And that is the complete budget Izzet Delver deck. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to vote for the next budget deck tech. My name's Adrian, this is Giant Monster Games, and like always, don't forget to game like a giant monster.